Hello everyone, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to be drawing the arterial supply to the brain, brainstem and cerebellum. So I'm going to be going through step by step of how to draw these vessels in this blank template, and so hopefully you can practice along. So one more time, we have a blank template here, and just for orientation purposes I'm gonna label a few structures. So we have a cerebral hemisphere here, and we have two of them, correct? So we have another one on this side. So we also have the cerebellum, we have the optic chiasma, and we have the brainstem. So we have the pons and the medulla. The midbrain would be up here, but it's hidden under the current structures. Okay, so now that we've oriented ourselves, remember this is a ventral surface, I'm going to remove some of these labels that I did so that we can actually start drawing the blood vessels. So I'm first going to start by drawing the paired vertebral arteries. So remember, these ascend in the neck in the foramen transversarium of the cervical vertebrae to finally enter the foramen magnum. So before that, these pairs of arteries are ascending. We have two of them. So here they're in the anterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. They enter the foramen magnum and they're going to fuse at the base of the pons to become the unpaired basilar artery, which is quite thick. Okay, so let's label that vertebral artery. So these are paired, remember that. Let's start drawing some of those branches straight off the vertebral artery. So let's draw the first branch here, which supplies the posterior and inferior surface of the cerebellum. So we're going to give it a corresponding name. So we're going to call it the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or PICA for short. So we have one on each side. That means they are paired. We can also draw, coming from the vertebral arteries, the single anterior spinal artery. And this artery is formed by a contribution of each vertebral artery, and the anterior spinal artery is then going to descend throughout the whole length of the spinal cord to supply its anterior aspect. So we have anterior spinal artery, unpaired. Let's put that here so that we are clear. If we have an anterior spinal artery, we also need to supply the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. So we're going to have posterior spinal arteries. Oops, sorry about that. Let's go back. So let's remember that we have some variation. So the posterior spinals can come from either the pica or the vertebral directly. So in this case, I'm just going to draw it coming off of the vertebral. Well, them, because they're paired. So we have posterior spinal arteries and they are paired. Okay. So now we can, as we move superiorly, we can draw the next pair of cerebellar arteries. So these ones are called the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, which are going to supply the anterior and inferior portions of the cerebellum. That's why we're going to call them anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, or AICA. So now we have reached the basilar artery at the base of the pons. And remember that from the basilar artery we have some tiny little branches that supply the surface, ventral surface of the pons. So we're going to call these the pontine branches. branches or transverse pontine arteries. So now that we're reaching the top of that basilar artery, we can draw the third pair of cerebellar arteries. So these ones go on to supply its superior surface. So we are going to call them superior cerebellar arteries. So again, one on each side. So we can appreciate that we have 3 pairs of cerebellar arteries, all coming from the vertebral basilar system. The terminal branches of this system are what we call the posterior cerebral arteries. Again, they're paired, one on each side. PCA for short. And these ones are going to go on and supply posterior aspects of the cerebrum, so the occipital lobes, as well as the inferior and medial aspects of the temporal lobe. So we've arrived at the end of the vertebral basilar system, and we can now draw the vessels coming from the internal carotid arteries. So remember, the internal carotids arise on either side of the optic chiasm. Just going to draw them here. Each of them is going to give rise to a middle cerebral artery and an anterior cerebral artery going medially and forwards. So let's label them. So this common trunk, the internal carotid artery, is going to give rise to the MCAs on either side and the anterior cerebral arteries, ACAs. So one more time, we can appreciate that we have 3 pairs of cerebral arteries. The ACA and MCA coming from the internal carotid, whereas the PCA came from the basilar artery. Lastly, we're going to close off the system to create our circle of Willis. So let's draw those communicating branches. So communicating between the internal carotid artery, or that junction between internal carotid and MCA, to the PCA, we have paired posterior communicating arteries. Let's call them PCOM, and they're paired. And connecting the 2 anterior cerebral arteries, we're going to have the anterior communicating artery. Let's call it ACOM. So now we have completed our circle of Willis, and hopefully you can practice doing these drawings many times. It's a good way of memorizing the different kinds of vessels